There is a 16-page document sitting on the table in front of you. By the time we are done with it, you will understand the Ethiopian catastrophe better than most people who lived through the headlines. This is not a leaked cable. It is not a secret report. It is something stranger. A scholarly interview titled The Ethiopian Economy, Nation Building and the Tigray War. An interview with Semahal Zenawi by Mehdi Labzaye, published in the French Africanist journal Politique Africaine, issue 173, the 1st of 2024, pages 163 to 178, in a dossier devoted to armed conflicts in the Horn of Africa. And today we are going to do to this document what it tries to do to a war. We are going to dissect it, every claim, every number, every silence, because this text may be the single most substantial insider account of the political economy behind one of the deadliest wars of our century. And it was given by a woman whose last name you already know. Start with what the document actually is, because its anatomy tells you what you can and cannot ask of it. It records a conversation between two people. On one side, Semahal Zenawi, described in the text's biographical note as a writer who has volunteered with organizations advocating for Tigray, including the Tigray External Affairs Office, and who is preparing a book on the undoing of the Ethiopian left. On the other, Mehdi Labzaye, a political scientist at the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, whose fieldwork concerns land, bureaucracy, and contentious politics in Ethiopia. And this was not one sitting. It was two, separated by 15 months and two capitals. Khartoum in November 2022, just days after the Pretoria Agreement was signed, and Addis Ababa in February 2024, more than a year into the uneasy post-war settlement. Beneath the conversation runs a second voice, 27 substantive footnotes added by Labzaye, which corroborate, contextualize, and occasionally quietly argue with the interviewee above them. Keep that second voice in mind. You will want it before we are finished, and you will want it badly. Now the two facts of provenance that shape everything, and we have to state them up front before we go anywhere near the arguments. First, the interviewee is the daughter of Meles Zenawi, Prime Minister of Ethiopia from 1995 to 2012, and the intellectual architect of the democratic developmental state, whose fate is this interview's central subject. The published text never announces the kinship in its biographical note, although the interviewee herself discloses a related positional fact late in the text, tracing her maternal lineage in Volkite back some 12 generations. If you grew up in Ethiopia, you need no reminding of who she is. If you are meeting this text cold, you may. And if you are one of them, this is the single most important fact you can carry into it. And you should see that this positionality cuts in two directions at once. It grants the text an insider's granularity that almost no other published source on late EPRDF politics possesses. Executive committee dynamics, retirement politics, the choreography of secret negotiations. And it simultaneously means the text is, among other things, a daughter's defense of a father's project against the people she believes dismantled it. Both facts are true at the same time. Uncomfortable? Good. So we will treat them the way the analysis does, as jointly constitutive of the document, not as a reason to believe everything and not as a reason to dismiss it. Second, the text announces its own ambition in its abstract. It wants to begin filling what it calls a void in political economy analyses of the Ethiopian civil war. And you need to understand what that framing really is. A polemic disguised as a research program. Because the dominant international explanations of the war that began in November 2020, the ones you almost certainly absorbed, have been institutional and ethno-political. A power struggle between a centralizing prime minister and a displaced former ruling party, refracted through the fraught architecture of multinational federalism. The interview's wager is that this entire framing mistakes symptom for cause, that the war's deepest roots lie somewhere far less telegenic, in decisions taken about land, labor, industry, railways and rents, roughly a decade before the first shots were fired, and everything else in the text, the periodization, the villains, the heroes, the account of Pretoria, the indictment of the aid system, follows from that single wager. So does the wager hold up? That is what we are here to find out. So how does a text like this actually work on you? Before we dissect the arguments, we have to dissect the form, because the form is doing argumentative work. The interview genre licenses a mode of claim-making that a peer-reviewed article never could. Assertions of insider knowledge that cannot be footnoted, counterfactual judgments, moral characterizations, and predictions. Zenawi uses all four of them, and you should be able to tell which one you are being handed at any moment. And underneath her, those scholarly footnotes perform a distinctive hybrid function. They anchor her assertions to published scholarship, Sarah Vaughan's chapter on the Haile Mariam years, Tom Lavers's 2023 Cambridge monograph on the developmental state's distributive crisis, Stefan Durkin's writing, Verhoeven and Voldemariam's article on Western policy. They supply dates and biographies for figures she names in passing, so you are never left guessing who is who. And in at least one instance, they preserve a primary source of real historical significance. The text of a mass distress message sent by the Tigrayan commander Tzadkan Gebretensai on the 15th of October 2022 as the defense of Shire collapsed. Hold on to that message. We will read it together later, and you will see why it matters. The effect is a document that operates as three things simultaneously: testimony, analysis, and archive. And do not mistake the interviewer for a neutral prompt machine. Labzai's 5 questions each embed a thesis. That the war has usually been explained ethno-nationally, that the developmental state was strongly anti-neoliberal, that Pretoria can be read as the TPLF trading its electoral mandate for survival, that the Ethiopian army has become a political arbiter, that the war was planned as much in Asmara as in Addis Ababa, and Zenawi's method, consistently, is to accept the question's factual premise while displacing its explanatory frame. Asked about ethnicity, she answers with land and labor. Asked about the army, she answers with Bonapartism and extraction. Asked about Eritrea, she answers with Washington and the UNDP. That displacement is the text's signature rhetorical operation, and recognizing it is essential to evaluating it. Because the interview rarely refutes rival explanations in detail, it subsumes them. Watch for that move. Once you can see it, you cannot unsee it, and you will see it 4 more times before we are done. One more formal observation before we open the body. The text is dense with named concepts, several of them the interviewee's own coinages, and they function as compressed arguments. The most important ones, and you want these where you can reach them: the facilitatory administration, her label for Haile Mariam Desalegn governments of 2012 to 2018, the movement from islands of success, the international financial institutions' enclave model of development, to securitized pockets of extraction, her label for the political economy consolidated after 2018, and the recurring characterization of Ethiopian politics, Tigray's included, as rent-sharing agreements among gambling elites. Think of each one as a scalpel, and we will examine every one of them at the point where it cuts, because a scalpel tells you a great deal about the surgeon. Now, the foundational move. The interview opens with its most consequential analytical decision, and you need to see it clearly, because everything downstream depends on it. Zenawi asserts that thinking about what led to the war, yours included, probably, and certainly mine, has concentrated on the cultural rather than the material, and she treats this as an epistemological failing of the entire field, not a local oversight. She does position a small cluster of works as partial exceptions moving in the right direction. Labzai's own research on land and Amhara irredentism in Wolkite, Vaughan on the Haile Mariam interregnum, Lavers on the distributive crisis of developmentalism, and, more ambivalently, Durkin. But she insists that even the political economy-adjacent literature has fixated on the developmental state's liberal democratic deficits rather than its economic record. Did the thing work? Did it feed people, employ them, industrialize them? That, she says, is the question nobody asked. And when did you last see anyone ask it? Her substantive counterclaim is precise and in its outline testable. the grievances that powered the Oromo protests of 2014 to 2018, the protests that ultimately brought down the EPRDF's old order, were about the terms on which land and labor were being released from agriculture into industry. Landlessness, joblessness, and a phrase she uses that should stop you: delayed adulthood, not press freedom, not electoral competition, not the things you were reading about in 2016. Do you see how large a substitution that is? She even reads the name adopted by the young Oromo protesters, Keru, a term from Oromo age-grade tradition denoting unmarried youth, as sociological evidence, an entire generational cohort blocked from the property and income that adulthood requires, and mobilized as that blockage. So we have to register 3 things about that move, and we owe her a fair hearing on all 3. First, and be fair here, the claim has substantial empirical support in the development literature she cites and beyond. Lavers's account, summarized accurately in the text's 3rd footnote, is precisely that the EPRDF became unable to distribute jobs, land and resources to a fast-growing population, producing a distributive crisis that delegitimated a project built on legitimation through growth. And Ethiopia's demographic arithmetic underwrites the point brutally. You are looking at a country where roughly 70% of the population is under 30. Estimates in the late 2010s put new labor market entrants at as many as 2 million per year, against a modern manufacturing sector that, on figures cited in the industrial parks literature, had generated only about 250,000 jobs in 3 decades. 2 million a year knocking, 250,000 seats total after 30 years. Do that arithmetic in your head and you have the protests. And rural landlessness among youth in the densely settled highlands, documented in the Ethiopia-wide village panel, studies the text's footnotes reference, was rising sharply through the 2010s. So the material pressures account of the Oromo protests is not eccentric. It is close to the emerging scholarly consensus, and the interview can fairly claim to have been articulating it early. You have to give her that one. So do we. Second, the dichotomy the text erects, material versus cultural, is more rhetorical than real, and the text itself quietly concedes as much. Zenawi acknowledges that ethnicity supplied the language through which local elites articulated claims to land and resources in Volkite, and that public ownership of land, entangled with the nationalities question, introduces distinctive strains into the Ethiopian case. Read that carefully, because you have just watched her hand the other side its best argument. It means the material grievances were lived, organized and weaponized ethnically, which is exactly what the ethno-political literature you were told to distrust actually claims. So what is the disagreement actually about? Causal ordering. And what a settlement would have to address. Not whether identity mattered. And third, here is where it gets uncomfortable for us, the move performs a subtle exculpatory function that we have to name out loud. Locating the war's origins in policy shifts of 2013 to 2018 places the decisive errors in the years after Meles Zenawi's death in August 2012. It frames the preceding 2 decades, the decades of her father's rule, as the baseline of coherence from which later leaders deviated. Convenient, is it not? Now, the interview never argues this crudely, and it does contain one significant criticism of Meles, which we will reach. But the periodization itself does normative work, and you should notice what appears in the text only obliquely, the pre-2013 EPRDF's own record, the post-election violence of 2005, in which security forces killed roughly 200 protesters, the mass arrests, the 2009 anti-terrorism and charities laws that hollowed out independent civil society, the 99.6% parliamentary sweep of 2010. None of that is placed in front of you here. All of it enters the text through a single side door, the episode of Meles's letter attacking the EU election observation mission, and otherwise stays off stage. A political economy of the catastrophe that brackets the coercive foundations of the earlier equilibrium is dissecting with one hand tied. Remember that phrase, It is the fairest one-line criticism of this entire document, and you and I will meet it again at the end. So that is the foundation, and we are standing on it now. Now watch the interview invert something you have probably read a dozen times. Where liberal commentary has typically presented Abiy Ahmed's centralization as a corrective, a response to an ethnic federalism that fragments the state, Zenawi argues the exact opposite, that the conflicts of the post-2018 period, the Tigray War included, are reactions to the undoing of multinationalism, to centralization itself, and that the centralizing drive is powered less by any particular nation-building ideology than by what she calls the dictates of the market as understood by orthodox economists. You should read that twice because it is the load-bearing sentence of her entire case. On this reading, hold your breath. The unitary state project and the neoliberal project are the same project. The institutional requirements of the Federal Democratic Republic, regional states with real fiscal and political weight, party structures accountable to national constituencies, obstruct the agglomeration of rents and the investor-legible governance that orthodox reform demands. And so the federation must be emasculated. Do you see what she has just done? She has taken the most moralized argument in Ethiopian politics and turned it into an accounting problem. And once you have seen it as an accounting problem, can you go back? She attributes a version of this diagnosis, and this is remarkable, to Arkeb Okubai, the former TPLF Central Committee member and industrial policy czar who sided with Abiy during the war, reporting his view that the institutional requirements of the federation complicate the rent agglomeration his industrialization model needed. She adds that the World Bank and IMF's revealed preference is for weak, geographically rather than ethnically defined regions. And then she issues a warning that reads very differently to you now than it did on the page when she first said it. Pursuing that design without apocalyptic violence is difficult to imagine. Sit with that one for a second. But here is where the record does something interviews rarely get to enjoy. Subsequent events bore on this claim in ways the text could only partly foresee, and they largely strengthen it. In the very month of the second sitting, the Bretton Woods institutions and the government were negotiating what became, 5 months later, the July 2024 package. On the 29th of July 2024, the National Bank of Ethiopia floated the birr. The same day, the IMF board approved a 4-year extended credit facility of about $3.4 billion with an immediate $1 billion disbursement. The World Bank pledged $16.6 billion over 3 years. And you should ask what exactly that money was rewarding, and stop, think of who was receiving this. A government that had just prosecuted a war whose civilian death toll the African Union's own mediator, Olusegun Obasanjo, publicly put at around 600,000. A government that was, by then, waging counterinsurgencies in Amhara and Oromia. The birr fell from about 57 to the dollar to over 100 by October 2024, and past 150 by late 2025, a depreciation exceeding 165%, with the predictable pass-through into food prices that pushed inflation back toward double digits by 2026. Ethiopia had already become one of the era's African sovereign defaulters, missing payment on its sole $1 billion Eurobond in late 2023 and entering common framework restructuring. Whatever you think about whether those reforms were necessary, the sequence vindicates the interview's core observation about the direction of travel. The international financial institutions' engagement deepened as, and arguably because, the multinational settlement was being dismantled, and the text's 7th footnote saw it coming with eerie precision. Noting more than $1.5 billion in World Bank assistance signed in 2022 alone, at the height of the war, and the bank's post-war reframing of the conflict as generic fragility. Now for the weaker limb of this section, because if we only praise, we are writing a eulogy, not a dissection, and you did not come here for a eulogy. Zenawi asks why, if multinational federalism explains Ethiopia's rightward lurch, structurally dissimilar polities, the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Saudi Arabia, Israel face the same tide. And she insists the prosperity regime cannot be understood outside the mainstreaming of the global far right. As provocation, the question lands, and you can feel exactly why it lands. It usefully denaturalizes the assumption that Ethiopia's crisis must have purely Ethiopian causes, and her identification of prosperity-era politics as right-wing populism, a description, she notes dryly, that is rarely applied to it, is analytically serious. The movement's combination of leader cult, prosperity gospel religiosity, majoritarian nostalgia, and privatizing economics fits the comparative type far better than the reformer frame long favored in Western coverage. But as argument, the section is gestural. No mechanism connecting the cases is specified beyond the ambient force of neoliberalism. And the text does not pause on the obvious disanalogies. India's right rose through competitive elections, Ethiopia's through the capture of an unelected transition. The passage is best read as the text marking a research program rather than executing one, a recurring feature of the interview genre that you and I will meet again. So the frame is set. Ready? Now comes the part of the interview where a man asks a woman when her father's life's work died. And she answers with a date. Ask yourself how you would handle that question. The interviewer puts it directly. When was the Ethiopian Democratic Developmental State laid in its coffin? And Zenawi's first move is to refuse the premise, not the death, the definition. You cannot define the model, she argues, by a checklist of interventions. Its interventions were decided empirically, from the particularities of a society's own history, in deliberate contrast to the universal prescriptions of the Washington Consensus. There was no template. What defined the model, she says, was mission and orientation. So how do you kill a mission? You cannot shoot it. You have to replace what it is for. Then she gives you the definition anyway, her father's, in paraphrase, in 3 parts. 1. An unwavering, existentially motivated commitment to accelerated development, in which failure is understood as a threat to the survival of the society itself, not a policy preference, a survival condition. 2. The diffusion through the population of the norms, the values, and the skills required to add value to the economy and to benefit from it. Development as something spread through people, not delivered to them. And 3. The one to watch, the relative autonomy of the state from the private sector and from other urban constituencies, explicitly including labor. 3 things we have to say about that definition. First, its bloodline is East Asian, and it is faithful to it. It compresses Chalmers Johnson's Plan Rational State, Peter Evans's Embedded Autonomy, and the Korean and Taiwanese emphasis on disciplining capital, and Melles's own unfinished writings, collected under the title African Development, Dead Ends and New Beginnings, argued for exactly that adaptation. This is not improvisation. It is a school of thought, and you should treat it as one. Second, and read the 3rd criterion again, because it deserves in italics the text never gives it. Autonomy from labor as well as capital. Sit with that for a moment, because it decides how you read everything she says about liberalism afterwards. It is a definition in which independent unions, and by extension much of liberal civil society, are not partners in development. They are obstacles to it. And here is where the interview's own machinery gets pointed away from itself. It criticizes neoliberal authoritarianism with real force, and it never once confronts the authoritarianism that this criterion licenses, the doctrine that governed Ethiopia's actual labor regime. Hold that thought for about 10 minutes of this analysis, because when we reach the flagship industrial parks, you will find the lowest garment wages of any major producing country on Earth. That is a fact very difficult to disentangle from a state doctrine that defined worker power as a constituency to be autonomous from. And third, this passage is the clearest single instance of the text's dual character. It is analysis. It is also inheritance management, the daughter restating the father's doctrine as the standard against which every successor will now be measured. And who set that standard? She just did. So when did it die? Her dating is unusually specific, and you are about to hear the central empirical claim of the entire interview. The developmental state died, she says, with 2 twinned launches. Tilk Tihadeso, deep renewal, the 15-year review initiated as a corrective to the model's perceived failures, and the second growth and transformation plan, GTP2, running 2015 to 2020, which fully articulated the transition from agriculture to industry policy, first introduced in 2013, midway through GTP1. Why is that death rather than adjustment? Her argument runs through space, through the map. Think of what the Meles-era megaprojects actually were. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the National Railway Programme, the Addis Ababa Light Rail, the Addis Djibouti Line. On her reading, those were conceived primarily as nation-building infrastructure, deliberately located against the gravitational pull of a historically Addis-centered market. Deliberately, because the entire premise of state intervention is to make unfeasible markets feasible. That is the job. If the market already wanted it, you would not need a state to build it. And the post-2013 policy inverted that premise completely. Watch each step of the inversion, because you are going to need all three. It assumed a homogeneous, consolidated national identity. It recentered development on market-proximate hubs. And it was therefore structurally incompatible with a multinational federation, not by accident, but by design logic. And she offers you an emblem for it, a single sentence. Around 2017, Hailemariam Desalegn visits Tigray and remarks that the region would not be getting a railway because it did not make market sense. That is it. That is the whole repeal. Did you catch how small it was? On her reading, an entire constitutional philosophy was quietly cancelled in one sentence about market sense, delivered on a regional visit. Then she layers a second axis onto the first, and we need both of them in view at once. The displacement of the domestic, technology-transferring firm by the foreign-invested export platform. On one side, the Metals and Engineering Corporation, METEC, the military-industrial conglomerate charged with the electromechanical works of the GERD and with the sugar program. That embodied the first model. On the other, the industrial parks of what she calls the Hawassa period. That embodied the second. And in the language of national innovation systems, she characterizes the shift as a move from a German-style diffusion model, spreading technological capacity broadly through an economy, to an Anglo-Saxon mission model of enclave excellence, which is to say, the islands of success, the phrase the international financial institutions prefer. And then the third layer, the political counterpart, which produces one of the most arresting details in the document. Bereket Simon. Hold that name because you are about to need it. Amhara National Democratic Movement veteran, longtime government spokesman, one of the most powerful men in the country. His diagnosis of the developmental state's failure was that it lacked political plurality. His remedy was to manufacture plurality, proportional representation, and concessions to opposition groups. Groups that Zenawi characterizes as precisely the parasitic elite that the developmental premise had identified as the problem in the first place. Now here is the detail that should make you sit up. Tigray was the only region that actually implemented Bereket's constitutional amendments toward proportional representation, and it did so in anticipation of the September 2020 regional election, the election that became the catalyst of the war. Read that again, because you will not find it anywhere else. The electoral reform that set up the confrontation was, on this account, an imported remedy authored in Addis Ababa by a man from another party, adopted in Mekelle alone. And she does not spare it either. Whatever its intentions, she judges the reform to have been pushed through without public discourse in a manner consistent with the same neoliberal authoritarianism she attacks everywhere else. That observation is doubly significant, and you should register both halves. It is a rare insider account of the ideational genealogy of Tigray's fateful 2020 electoral reform, where the idea came from and who carried it. And it is the interview's most conspicuous instance of criticizing Tigray's own leadership by exactly the same standard it applies to Addis Ababa. Keep score on that one. It comes back, and you will want to remember where it came from. Now the interview narrates the international consecration of the shift. And this is the passage that requires the most careful handling of any in the document. So we are going to slow down and sort it into what is documented, what is plausible, and what rests on her word alone. Her account runs like this, and I want you keeping a tally as it goes. GTP2 was praised by the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, as a step in the right direction, after more than a decade of tumultuous relations between the IMF and the EPRDF. GTP2, she says, was the primary driver behind Barack Obama's July 2015 visit to Addis Ababa, the first ever by a sitting American president. And during that visit, she claims, the American interest centered on liberalizing power generation and on securing General Electric's involvement in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The chief executive of METEC, Kinfey Dagnew, refused to allow it. That refusal, she continues, put him at loggerheads with Haile Mariam. And shortly afterwards, METEC became the only state-owned enterprise ever investigated by Parliament. So, what holds? Let us sort it, document it, and we can check every word of it. Obama did visit in July 2015 with a delegation and an agenda in which Power Africa, the 2013 US initiative organized around private participation in electricity, figured prominently. The IMF's 2016 Article 4 consultation was indeed strikingly warm about GTP2's growth-oriented reforms, and parliamentary scrutiny of METEC's performance did occur before the change of government, with a committee in mid-2018 finding hundreds of millions of dollars in machinery squandered without market study. Plausible, but resting on her testimony alone. That GE's entry into the GERD's turbine works was pressed at the political level and refused by Kinfey, and that the parliamentary investigation was retaliation for that refusal. No document in the public record establishes either link. It is insider testimony, offered as insider testimony, and you should file it exactly that way. And then there is the part that complicates her frame, which we have to put on the table because leaving it off would be advocacy, not analysis. The fullest public reckoning with METEC came under Abiy, not under Haile Mariam. The corporation was stripped of the GERD contract in August 2018 after years of delay on the turbine installations. In November 2018, Kinfey Dagnew was arrested near the Sudanese border in a televised operation, with the Attorney General alleging roughly 37 billion birr in international procurement between 2012 and 2018 conducted without competitive bidding, at prices inflated, in instances hundreds of times over. So which version is true? Which one do you take home? Here is the uncomfortable answer, and we do not enjoy giving it. On the record as it stands, both are. METEC was simultaneously what Zenawi says it was, the institutional carrier of the domestic capability model, whose destruction was a policy choice dressed up as anti-corruption, and what the prosecutors said it was, an unaccountable military conglomerate that failed to deliver its flagship works. Those two descriptions are not mutually exclusive, however much you want them to be. Military-industrial developmentalism has produced exactly that combination in other countries, repeatedly. And there is a coda, and we have to report that it cuts in her favor. After more than 5 years of proceedings, the charges collapsed. Kinfey Dagnew was released in March 2024, the month after the interview's second sitting, without conviction on the grand corruption counts that had justified the entire spectacle. Then, Zenawi closes the section with a bill of indictment against the industrial policy turn. 4 counts. Let us take them one at a time. It failed to generate employment at anything near the scale of the youth dividend. Exports were lower in 2016 than in 2012, despite an economy that described itself as export-oriented. Social indicators reversed, and above all, less than a decade after the turn, Ethiopia was once again the world's poster child for war and famine, a catastrophic reversal of the nation-building gains that were, she insists, the model's true bottom line. Does the statistical record support her? Substantially, we find, on the first 2 counts, and it complicates the surrounding narrative in one important way. Take exports first, and watch what happens to your assumptions. National Bank of Ethiopia series show merchandise exports peaking around $3.1 to $3.25 billion in the early 2010s, then sliding to roughly $2.9 billion by 2015-16. Stagnation against a rapidly growing economy. which left goods exports averaging only 3.8% of GDP across 2015 to 2020, one of the lowest ratios in the world. Here is the line that makes it concrete. By the end of that decade, the operating revenue of Ethiopian Airlines alone exceeded the entire country's goods exports, one airline, against everything the country sold abroad. If you want one number for the failure of an export strategy, there it is. Now take employment, because this is the number that should bother you most. The flagship Hawassa Industrial Park opened in July 2016 with a target of 60,000 workers. By late 2019, it employed roughly 25,000. By late 2023, about 28,000. Base pay for its overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly female workforce was around 750 birr a month, with allowances roughly $38 at the exchange rate of the time. And a widely cited 2019 study from NYU's Stern Center found entry wages of about $26 a month, the lowest of any major garment-producing country on the planet. And what kind of industrial policy is that? Then the enclave's fragility got demonstrated in the most direct way possible. In January 2022, Ethiopia was expelled from the US African Growth and Opportunity Act over the atrocities of the war. Anchor investors exited. More than 10,000 people lost their jobs. And did anyone in Washington count them? Small, low-paid, externally revocable. Is that an industrial strategy or a rental agreement? The islands of success, when you actually measure them, are exactly what the diffusion versus mission contrast predicted they would be. Now the complication, because we promised to look for those, and we are not going to flinch from one just because it is inconvenient for a good argument. Later in the interview, she says the economy began to crash in 2016. Headline output did not crash. Real GDP growth ran near double digits through 2017. And critics of the interview from within the Tigrayan scholarly community have pressed exactly this point against her periodization. They are not wrong about the number. So is her whole date wrong? But look at what the aggregate conceals, because we do not stop at headline numbers here. 2015-16 brought a severe drought. The collapse of the export and debt-financed investment model into a foreign exchange crisis, with reserves below 2 months of imports, an unserviceable state enterprise debt overhang, the eruption of the Oromo and Amhara protest waves, and the state of emergency of October 2016. A charitable reading, and on the evidence, the correct one, is that crash denotes the exhaustion of the model's distributive and external financing capacity, not a GDP event. Which is, in fact, precisely the Laver's thesis the interview endorses. The word is loose. The claim underneath it is not. Keep those two things separate every time you hear it. Which brings us to the EPRDF itself, the coalition that ruled Ethiopia for 27 years and then unmade itself. And the interview's treatment of it opens by demolishing two things you have almost certainly been told. Demolition 1. The EPRDF as monolith. Whatever you were told, forget it, she argues. The coalition was structurally beholden to the regional constituencies of its constituent parties. The legitimacy a party enjoyed at home determined the power it could project federally. That is a real accountability mechanism, however crude, and its successor, the Prosperity Party, does not have it. And the member parties had genuinely divergent political cultures, including, in an aside that turns out to be pregnant, the growing importance of evangelical networks within the OPDO and the Southern Movement, a phenomenon whose significance for the religious politics of the Prosperity-era scholarship has only since begun to register. She also notes an asymmetry of competitive pressure that quietly explains a great deal. The TPLF, having militarily eliminated rivals like the EDU back in the 1970s, never faced in Tigray the kind of contestation the OPDO faced in Oromia. That single fact explains both the TPLF's organizational solidity and its complacency. The party that never has to fight at home is the party that forgets how. Remember that when we get to 2020. Demolition 2, and this one is bolder, the big man. She rejects the reliance, even in the best scholarship, and she names Vaughan and Lavers on the death of Meles to explain the growing assertiveness of the regions and the breakdown of cohesion after 2012. She calls it a form of analytical laziness, drawing on the African strongman stereotype. And is she wrong about us? And her counter-evidence is biographical and, given its source, remarkable. In 2010, at the supposed height of his unchallenged influence, Meles Zenawi was unable to retire. Not just unable to retire himself, unable to retire the old guard slated for retirement under Metakakat, the generational succession plan. He could not make it happen. Does that sound to you like an unchallengeable strongman? She judges that failure to retire, even at the cost of his ties to the party, to be his most consequential political error. And she can recall only one single occasion on which he spoke without his party's consent. The 2005 letter attacking Anna Gomes's EU election observation report, an act, she notes, that it was politically embarrassing for him to walk back. That passage does two jobs at once, and we should credit both of them. Analytically, it relocates causation from a death to a process. What needs explaining is not the disappearance of one man. It is the decay of a party's decision-making organs as arbiters of contestation. Rhetorically, it inoculates the text against the charge of filial hagiography. The daughter criticizes the father on the record. But look at the shape of the criticism. His great error was insufficient self-abnegation, a failure to leave. The substance of his rule is not touched. And did you notice that it was not? And the footnote Labzai appends to the Gomes episode, detailing her later alignment with pro-siege positions and hate-adjacent accounts, quietly converts the anecdote into a second indictment of the international community, foreshadowing everything the text will say later. Now the positive account, and we owe it a careful hearing. And here you get the densest, most original contribution the interview makes to the historiography of how the EPRDF ended, because it proceeds through institutional mechanics rather than personalities. The party's policy-making function was weakened as the less ideological tinkering was pushed ahead through the concentration of institutional power in the Prime Minister's office, where old guard figures displaced from party structures by Metakakat had quietly reassembled as advisors and special envoys. Follow that carefully, because you are watching a party hollow itself out. The generational renewal plan pushed the old guard out of the party organs, and they landed in the executive office instead. The bodies that were supposed to arbitrate lost their people. The office that was not supposed to decide gained them. Do you want a one-sentence history of how a party dies? That is it. The changes themselves were crafted and driven largely by the TPLF's own old guard, publicly associated with Arkabe Okubai, and bulldozed past the party organs whose entire function was to arbitrate exactly such disputes. And critically, the leadership initially refused to admit the changes were changes. Compare that with the recalibrations of the late 1980s and the early 2000s, which were openly debated at Congress. This time, the shift was denied while it happened, and that destroyed the institutional clarity on which cohesion depended. A coalition can survive a fight over policy. What it cannot survive is being told there is no fight. Do you see the difference? One is disagreement. The other is telling an entire party that it is imagining things. And she dates the beginning of neoliberal authoritarianism in Ethiopia precisely. Not to 2018, where you would expect it. To 2016, to the law that replaced the Ministry of Justice with an Attorney General accountable to the Prime Minister. A subordination of the prosecutorial power that, as Labzai's footnote observes, Abiy simply inherited, and then staffed with regime intellectuals who are now designing transitional justice. Then the economic model stopped delivering after 2016. And ambitious younger cadres, particularly in the OPDO, substituted right-wing populism, stoking anti-Tigrayan sentiment for the economic populism the front could no longer supply. That is the mechanism, not ancient hatred resurfacing. So where did the hatred come from? It came from a budget line that ran dry. Think of it as a cheaper product, wheeled out when the expensive one ran out. And with the loot of 2018, the upheaval, the changeover, the model shifted from never-realized islands of success to securitized pockets of largely illicit extraction. Mediated by Middle Eastern capital, a degrowth pattern she identifies across Sudan, Somalia, and the Sahel, with a footnote anchoring the claim to Duffield and Stockton's work on Gulf-driven destructive commerce in the Horn. Several strands there deserve weighing separately, so let us weigh them. The Attorney General periodization is a genuinely sharp institutionalist claim. It identifies a legally datable moment when horizontal accountability was formally folded into executive power, 2 years before Abiy took office. And it has the virtue of making neoliberal authoritarianism a specifiable arrangement, prosecution as an executive instrument in the service of investor-facing order, rather than an epithet you throw at people you dislike. The anti-Tigrayan populism as substitute claim compresses a real and documented dynamic. The protest years of 2016 to 2018 saw the diffusion, including through diaspora satellite media, of a discourse that conflated Tigrayan elites, the TPLF, and Tigrayans as such. The post-2018 leadership rode that discourse and amplified it. The interview's contribution is to give it a political economy function, populism as the cheap substitute for distribution. And the pockets of extraction thesis is the interview's most predictive construct. You will want to remember it. Remember that phrase, because in about 15 minutes, we are going to watch subsequent investigative reporting confirm it. In Tigray itself, the section closes with the formula that names the whole text's theory of elite behavior. The descent into backroom horse trading and the endless, humanly catastrophic realignments among political actors are consistent, she says, with a conceptualization of politics as little more than rent-sharing agreements among gambling elites. That formula is doing more conceptual work than it looks, so we should unpack it. It fuses the developmental state literature's distinction between productive and parasitic elites, the vanguard party's task having been to transform the latter into the former, with a gambling metaphor that captures the specific recklessness of post-2018 realignments, coalitions made and broken against the odds, with other people's lives as the stake. And you never hear the losers named, and it universalizes, because as the next section shows, she applies that formula to Tigray's post-war leadership without exemption, which is both her moral distinction and, for critics of the TPLF who find the formula arriving about 2 decades late, her irony. The EPRDF's opponents had been describing its endowment fund economy in adjacent terms since the 1990s. That genealogy the text does not acknowledge. File it with the silences. We collect them all at the end. Now Pretoria, the agreement that ended the shooting, and if you only know one thing about this war, it is probably this, and the interview's account of it begins with something that is not in the public record. Labzai asks whether the TPLF is more divided after Pretoria than it was during the war, and Zenawi's first move is to relocate the constraint upstream. The Pretoria negotiations, she says, were pre-constrained by a secret agreement concluded in the Seychelles, at a moment when Tigray's bargaining position was stronger, whose terms remain hidden to this day. And it was there, in the Seychelles, that unfettered humanitarian access entered the table, the very thing the TPLF had publicly refused to negotiate over. Tigray's principal negotiator was Asifa Abraha, answering directly to Debretsion Gebremichael as his special envoy to the Horn, none of which you would find in a news report. Contemporaneous reporting did register secret federal TPLF contacts in mid-2022, including a Seychelles channel. That much we can verify. But the interview's specificity, the personnel, the reporting lines, the identification of the humanitarian access concession goes beyond anything published and stands as one of the document's principal primary source contributions. Offered, as ever in this genre, on the interviewee's authority and nothing else. So do you believe her? Hold that question. Then she complicates the interviewer's premise that Pretoria's function was simply TPLF survival, and she does it with 2 pieces of internal evidence. At least a third of Tigray's negotiating team was not TPLF at all, including individuals publicly resentful of the party. And the loudest opposition to the agreement has come from the TPLF itself, from the party on whose behalf it was supposedly signed. So why were the terms so humiliating? Her explanation is situational, and here the interview functions once again as archive. The federal side believed it could take Mekelle outright. Parts of Tigray's own central command thought the capital's fall was inevitable. After Shire fell, Tzadkan Gebretensai sent a mass distress text message to international contacts. Dated by the footnote to 15th of October 2022, its full text preserved there, warning that the defense of Shire had collapsed for want of ammunition and that the world was about to watch another genocide. She calls it a remarkable historical document. She is right, and you can only read it at all because a French political scientist put it in a footnote, and only the adoption of what Commander Tadesse Wereda termed flexible defense, holding a line around Shire, keeping the federal army out of Mekelle, created what negotiating space existed at all. Her call for scholarly scrutiny of why particular military strategies were adopted and others were not is one of the text's very few explicit research invitations. It is also an implicit criticism of choices she pointedly declines to specify. Whose choices, she will not say. Then comes her characterization of the settlement itself, and it is maximalist and very carefully worded. Pretoria and Nairobi, she says, are surrender documents of remarkable legal simplicity that, along with lending war crimes a supposed legality, had as their primary goal the overturning of Tigray's democratic will, meaning the elected government produced by the September 2020 regional election. And the disbanding of Tigrayan resistance was made inevitable, she argues, because the agreement signed away resistance's political premise and its organizing principle, elected government. Now let us dissect that, because you have to hold the claim against two things at once: the documents and the contested status of that election. On the documents, we have to say she is substantially right. The cessation of hostilities agreement did commit the TPLF to disarmament. It did recognize the federal constitutional order, and it did provide for an interim regional administration, appointed, not elected, pending elections that had not been held when the interview closed, and were not held for years after. The settlement did replace an administration derived from a regional election with one derived from negotiation and federal assent. That is the factual core of her characterization, and it stands. You have to grant her that. What the characterization eludes is the nature of the thing being defended. The September 2020 election was itself held in defiance of the federal postponement of all elections under COVID-19 justifications. It was declared void by the federal houses in advance, and it returned the TPLF with a reported vote share above 98%, which makes it, simultaneously and irreducibly, two things: an exercise of regional constitutional self-assertion and a plebiscitary ratification by a party that had never permitted serious competition at home, a fact the interview itself supplies in the very section we just went through. Her framing of democratic will therefore inherits all the ambiguity of the thing it names. So can you defend an election and doubt it in the same breath? Here, you have to. What cannot be disputed is the asymmetry she identifies elsewhere in the same section. The constituency that paid for the leadership's return, rural Tigray, was precisely the constituency the post-war settlement proceeded to abandon. Hold that. It is the thread we finish in the final section, and then comes the most distinctive analytical move in the whole document, and it is the one you are least likely to have heard anywhere else. She argues that the visible post-Pretoria factionalism, which is real and which was fueled, though not created by the agreements and by the negotiating team's opacity, actually obscures a deeper elite consensus in Tigray. She is careful first to draw a line. No credible genocide accusation attaches to Tigray's leadership, and she therefore rejects any equivalence with the federal government. Fine. But then she says the underlying conceptualization of politics, the rent-sharing formula, is now shared across Tigray's political class, its would-be civic actors, the global society of Tigray scholars, and its religious leadership. And that despite all the sloganeering, there is consensus even on abandoning the TPLF's own social base, and her evidence is philological, linguistic. The kind of evidence only a native participant observer can produce, which means you will not find it in any think tank report. She watches the vocabulary of the Abiy regime migrate into Tigrayan public debate. Opposition parties get renamed competitive parties. Tekawami becomes Tenahanati. And the political conversation coalesces around Brake, a Tigrinya calque of prosperity's own Kefeta, elevation. Same word, different language. Picture it. Merkel speaking Addis Ababa's political vocabulary back to itself and calling it a reform agenda. Her conclusion arrives with the harshest label the text possesses, imported straight from dependency theory. Politics in Ethiopia, Tigray included, has become a textbook rent-seeking political economy, captained by the archetypal African comprador. 2 notes on that, and we will keep them short. First, the linguistic argument is methodologically elegant, vocabulary adoption as an unobtrusive measure of ideological capture. But a skeptic will point out that lexical borrowing can indicate discursive hegemony, meaning you have to speak the ruler's language just as easily as it indicates genuine conversion. The interview does not adjudicate between those 2 readings, and in fairness, neither can we. Second, and this matters for how you read the entire document, this passage marks the decisive break with any reading of the text as TPLF apologetics. Its account of post-war Tigray, with leadership consensus on abandoning the peasantry, gambling elites, comprador capture, is more corrosive than most external criticism of the TPLF has managed. And later, regional reporting on intra-elite struggles over gold, over budgets, over the composition of the interim administration, has run in its direction rather than against it. Now the army. And here we have to slow down again. Because by the time of the second sitting, the Ethiopian military had become something new. States of emergency, command posts, generals as the only critics the Prime Minister appeared to tolerate. Labzai asks whether that changes the nature of the Ethiopian state. And Zenawi does what she does every single time, refuses the institutional frame and answers through political economy. By now you can predict her. Militarization, she argues, should be read through the same lens as everything else in this text. Neoliberal reform has always arrived accompanied by state violence. From Pinochet's Chile to, in a deliberately scandalous flattening, that she immediately qualifies as involving violence of a different category, Macron's France. The states of emergency under Haile Mariam, 2016 to 2018, belong to that pattern. Do you accept the comparison? She knows you might not. And under Abiy, the model completed its movement, from islands of success to securitized pockets of extraction on the Sudanese, Somali, and Sahelian pattern. And then she reaches, self-deprecatingly, for what she calls an old-fashioned instrument. The Marxist analysis of Bonapartism, applied to Ethiopia by the student movement thinker Addis Hiwet back in the 1980s, and revived around the Tihadeso period. The thesis being that the social structure produced by the 1974 revolution, never transcended despite the gains made after Tihadeso, remains conducive to an abortive revolution giving rise to a military bureaucratic apparatus accountable to no societal constituency at all and caring only for itself. She quotes that formulation from Tony Weiss's Oxford doctoral thesis on vanguard capitalism, and then she translates it into the developmental state's own technocratic register. What was abandoned, she says, was the attempt to transform the economy from one that incentivizes predatory extraction by elites into one that rewards productive value addition in markets capable of supporting complex transactions. That layering rewards attention because it tells you what kind of mind produced this text. 3 separate vocabularies are being run in parallel. Dependency theory's comprador, classical Marxism's Bonaparte, and new institutionalist development economics, with its extractive versus productive elites, and treated as intertranslatable descriptions of the same object. That syncretism is characteristic of the EPRDF's own intellectual culture, which moved between Marxist-Leninist organizational theory and heterodox developmental economics without the slightest embarrassment. The passage is evidence about its author's tradition, even as it analyzes that tradition's collapse. And the Pinochet to Macron line functions as a tell of the text's normative architecture. Its consistent polemical target is liberalism as force. And it is markedly more comfortable specifying that violence than the violence of the vanguardist state it mourns. The 1974 social structure gets blamed. Bonapartism gets blamed. But the EPRDF's own 17 years of emergency-adjacent rule before 2018 sit outside the frame entirely. And you should be asking who drew the frame. Then the section closes with a prediction. Concrete, falsifiable, made in February 2024. And this is where the text earns something no framework can be argued into. Watch closely, because you are about to see an analysis pay for itself. She says the role the military now plays in the political economy is linked to the entrenchment of a purely extractive economy, and that it is likely the Tigrayan state and the Tigray Defense Forces will use violence to enforce new economic relationships with Canadian and other mining interests, set to displace the artisanal miners who had been operating within a protected domestic market. That is the prediction. So did it come true? Watch what happened. Within months, Vancouver-listed East Africa Metals announced that its Chinese development partner, Tibet Huayu Mining, 70% owner of the Adiabo project, was procuring heavy equipment to begin mine construction at Matobula and Dartambuk in Tigray. In 2024, the Federal Ministry of Mines extended the company's development licenses to 2028, and reporting in mid-2024 described federal ministries backing the return of foreign license holders against a regional bureau that was licensing only former TDF combatants and local artisanal associations, with locals threatening to destroy equipment if large-scale miners entered. Then, in November 2025, a joint investigation by the Globe and Mail and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, drawing on dozens of miners, security officials, and industry sources, documented essentially the exact scenario the interview had sketched. Industrial-scale illegal extraction on the East Africa Metals licensed sites from early 2024, financed through Chinese business partners, worked alongside Tigrayan military officers, guarded by armed men controlling smuggling networks, artisanal miners reduced to what one researcher called a captive workforce, and the gold leaving the region unrecorded, a trade that Chatham House Analysis described as fueling conflict and empowering armed actors rather than rebuilding the region. And Zenawi herself, in subsequent public interventions, has alleged collaboration between federal generals and TDF commanders in exporting Tigrayan gold to the United Arab Emirates, which closes the circle with the Gulf-mediated extraction thesis she laid out in the interview. Whatever else you conclude about this text, hold on to that. Its political economy machinery demonstrated predictive power that the ethno-institutional frameworks it criticizes did not even attempt. Which brings us to the indictment. And it has two defendants, one of whom the interview barely bothers to charge. Which one do you think walks? Labzai's final questions raise Eritrea, whose preparation and execution role in the war he describes as clear. And her treatment of it is the briefest and most conspicuous swerve in the entire document. Blink and you miss it. She grants that the portrayal of Isaias Afwerki as the mastermind and Abiy as the lapdog was general. She notes that post-Pretoria maneuvering showed the two to be at least evenly matched in nefariousness. And then she declares that the regional focus obscures the war's more international causes, and moves on. That compression is itself analyzable, and you should analyze it. A text centrally concerned with accountability devotes one sentence to the state whose army carried out a large share of the documented atrocities. Why? So what is going on? The structural explanation is that Eritrean agency fits awkwardly into the interview's master frame. Asmara's participation was not driven by market orthodoxy or by IFI preference. Isaias did not invade Tigray because the World Bank prefers geographically defined regions. And so the text resolves the anomaly by minimization. This is the clearest case in the whole document of the framework disciplining the evidence rather than the evidence disciplining the framework. Mark it because it is the one place where you can watch the machinery run the argument. The Washington indictment that follows is the opposite, the most developed empirical section she gives you. Its foundation is Verhoeven and Voldemariam's 2022 article, credited with chronicling Western involvement not only in Abiy's rise, but in underwriting the concentration of power around his person, in breach of the Ethiopian constitution and of international humanitarian law, with market opening as the primary driver. And onto that, she builds a close reading of a leaked UNDP memo from early in the war. She specifies its authorship, written by Africa Bureau head Ahuna Ezeakonwa, signed by Administrator Akim Steiner, and reported at the time by Foreign Policy as echoing Ethiopian government talking points. Her dissection of that memo proceeds through 4 charges, and they escalate. Count them with us. 1. It regurgitated federal talking points. 2. It treated grave crimes, including the ethnic cleansing of Volkite. And here is where she discloses her own 12-generation maternal lineage in that very place, as regrettable but inevitable incidents of war. 3. It justified the pre-war withdrawal of Tigray's federal budget as a legitimate means of weakening the TPLF. Think of what that sentence actually means. It means a UN development agency underwrote the state's abdication of its obligations to its own citizens over an intra-party dispute. And 4. It presented the indefinite suspension of the right to elected representation as a precondition for protecting Tigrayan rights, while rationalizing the postponement of elections nationwide until the Prime Minister's opponents had been neutralized. Her summary judgment is the most quoted against line in the interview, that the memo concisely represents the international community's encouragement of genocide in exchange for market penetration. And she adds the institutional irony, which is almost too neat to be real. The UNDP's $40 million seeds program, supporting elections for Ethiopian democratic strengthening, ended by justifying the violent nullification of the very elections it existed to support, plus the generalization underneath it all, that the conflation of the TPLF with the Tigrayan population was not an Abiy idiosyncrasy. It was globally accepted and normalized, including, she would say, by you. Now separate the layers, because this is where we either do our job or become an amplifier. That the memo existed, that it leaked, and that it read as sympathetic to Addis Ababa's framing. Documented in the contemporaneous Foreign Policy reporting the footnote cites. That Western and multilateral engagement continued and deepened through the war years, documented in the disbursement record we already went through, and the strongest independent corroboration of her budget withdrawal charge. The federal government did suspend transfers to Tigray in 2020 after the September election, a fiscal siege preceding the military one. Did you know that part? Most people do not. But the maximal formulation, encouragement of genocide in exchange for market penetration, is an inference about motive that the documents themselves cannot establish. What the documents establish is indifference structured by interest, which is the same charge in its defensible form. It is not a lesser charge. It is a survivable one. And if you want the indictment to stick, that is the version you take into court. And on the genocide designation itself, which the interview uses as settled description throughout, the UN's International Commission and the US government formally found war crimes and crimes against humanity by multiple parties, with the State Department in March 2023 specifying ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, while stopping short of a genocide determination. Meanwhile, a body of scholarly and civil society analysis, including a 2024 report from the New Lines Institute, argues that the genocide threshold is met. Her usage, in other words, sits inside a live juridical and scholarly contest, not outside it. We record that status. We do not presume to resolve it. Then the final movement, the humanitarian system. And her claims here are specific enough to check line by line. So we will. She asserts that aid agencies extended the siege by suspending humanitarian aid, initially to Tigray alone, ostensibly over thefts that were later found to have been carried out largely by the Ethiopian army, by the Prime Minister's office, and by the World Food Programme itself, whose wartime conduct she calls appalling. That the suspension was lifted only after agreements to undo what remained of rural social assets. That the punishment targeted the Wareda-level delivery system, despite evidence of theft organized through the country's highest office, revealing, she says, how the aid industry creates markets for itself. And then the factual bedrock beneath the polemic, that the war took place largely in rural Tigray, where 85% of the destroyed health facilities and schools were rural social assets, that parts of Tigray's leadership now call the rural economy too cumbersome to carry, and that the Tigrayan economy, at the time of speaking, supported tens of starvation-related deaths a week, making the abandonment of the farmers who had shielded the leadership and returned it to power a remarkable betrayal. Now check it, because the verifiable record aligns with the skeleton of that account to a degree that will surprise you. The WFP informed partners on 20th April 2023 that it was pausing food deliveries to Tigray amid theft reports. USAID followed on 3rd May. Both extended the pause countrywide in June after investigators found diversion in 7 of the country's 9 regions, including one documented instance of stolen US-supplied wheat, enough to feed 134,000 people for a month, on sale in a single Tigrayan market. Contemporaneous reporting, including in the Washington Post, described a scheme benefiting Ethiopian military units, and the Tigray Interim Administration's own investigative committee reported in June 2023 that federal government entities and Eritrean forces had played the larger roles in the diversion. And the human cost of the pause? Tigray's Disaster Risk Commission tallied 1,411 starvation deaths in just 3 of the region's zones by August 2023. By May, 71% of screened pregnant and lactating women were acutely malnourished. Full resumption came only in stages through late 2023, USAID's in December, after reforms to targeting and registration. So her chronology, a suspension spanning roughly March to December 2023, is accurate in outline, and we have to say so plainly. Her attribution of organized theft to federal organs has the regional inquiry's preliminary findings behind it, and her charge that the response punished the destitute rather than the organizers is the same conclusion religious leaders and humanitarian critics drew at the time, in real time. 2 of her formulations outrun the record, and we do not get to let those slide, implicating the WFP in the thefts themselves, as opposed to negligence and complicity-adjacent failures amid resignations of its country leadership, and characterizing the reformed aid modalities as agreements to undo rural social assets, which is a tendentious gloss on the shift away from state channel distribution, though one connected to a real debate about bypassing the Warada system. Her rural devastation baseline, though, if anything, it is conservative. WHO assessment found 86% of Tigray's health service delivery units structurally damaged. MSF found fewer than 1 in 10 facilities functioning, and 73% looted. Maternal mortality quadrupled from 186 to roughly 840 per 100,000 teens by May 2022. Of a pre-war health workforce approaching 20,000, about 1,300 remained by 2022. And the pre-war architecture those numbers describe, 712 rural health posts, 233 health centers, was precisely the rural social asset base that 2 decades of the developmental state had built, and that 3 years of war and blockade unbuilt. 2 decades up, 3 years down, hold that ratio in your head. So, we draw the threads together, because if you sort every principal claim in this interview against the data, they fall into 4 evidentiary classes, and the sorting is the whole point of a dissection. Class 1. Claims independently corroborated, some of them predictively, the ones you can take to the bank. The export stagnation of the mid-2010s, the enclave model's failure on employment and on wages, the constitutional mechanics of the 2016 Attorney General law, the deepening embrace of the international financial institutions through and after the war, culminating in the July 2024 float and facility package, the fiscal siege of Tigray preceding the military one, the aid diversion chronology and its federal organ findings, the rural concentration of the war's destruction, and most strikingly of all, the militarized extraction prognosis for Tigrayan gold. Class 2. Plausible insider testimony that the public record can neither confirm nor refute. The G. Gerd episode and Kinfe Dagnew's refusal. The Seychelles Agreement's terms and personnel. The internal texture of executive committee politics. and the attribution of the Tilk Tihadeso design to the TPLF Old Guard around Arkebe Okubai. These are the passages for which future historians will cite this text as a primary source, and you should watch them do it, with the source-critical care that status demands. Class 3. Contestable interpretive frames. The periodization of death by 2015, against which critics note near double-digit growth through 2017, answerable as we showed, but contestable. The reading of the September 2020 election as unambiguous democratic will, the encouragement of genocide formulation of Western motive, and the WFP's direct implication in theft. And Class 4 contains exactly one item, and it is a structural artifact rather than a claim, the near silence on Eritrea. One item. Does that surprise you now? Best explained by the limits of the frame, not by the evidence. Across all 4 classes, a consistent intellectual profile emerges, and we should name it plainly because it is our finding. The text's strength is mechanism. It repeatedly converts what other accounts treat as atmosphere, polarization, hatred, chaos, into specifiable arrangements. A law, a plan document, a license, a vocabulary shift, a budget line. When did you last see polarization explained by a budget line? And its predictions succeed wherever its machinery of rents, spatial logic, and elite incentives actually grips, and its weakness is symmetry. You saw that coming. The machinery is applied at full force to Haile Mariam's facilitators, to Abai's Prosperity Party, to the IFIs, to the aid complex, and, to its genuine credit, to post-war Merkel, and it idles the moment it is pointed at the pre-2013 order, whose coercive and rent-managed foundations produced the very elites the text condemns. Put it in one line and you have the verdict. The interview criticizes the big man theory of the EPRDF's decline, while leaving perfectly intact a big project theory of the EPRDF's virtue. And if we only follow the points she raises, we have done half a dissection. You also have to register what is structurally absent, because the silences in this text are patterned, not random. It never discusses the events of 3 and 4th of November 2020, the attack on the Northern Command, which the federal government names as the war's trigger, and around which an entire contested literature exists. The causal account simply begins upstream of the question of who fired first, which is a very convenient place for a story to begin, would you not say? It does not engage the TPLF's 27 years of dominance within the pre-2018 security and intelligence apparatus, which is the factual substrate of the resentments the text explains as manufactured populism. You cannot fully explain the demand for anti-Tigrayan politics without the thing that supplied its raw material. It does not address EPRDF-era famine politics, or the surveillance of aid distribution through party structures, or the closure of political space between 2005 and 2010, except through the Gomes letter. And those omissions matter precisely because the text's indictment of the aid industry and of electoral nullification would gain force, not lose it, if it were shown to apply across regimes rather than only to this one. And it does not present the Amhara narrative of Wolkite, except as elite instrumentalization of ethnicity layered atop investor land politics. A framing consistent with Labzai's own scholarship, but one that resolves by assumption a dispute the war has made existential for 2 entire communities. And none of those silences falsifies what the text does argue. We should be clear about that. Together, they mark the perimeter, the fence line inside which a formidable analytical engine was permitted to run. And who built the fence? So what does the document achieve? Judge it by its own declared ambition to begin filling the void in political economy analyses of the Ethiopian civil war, and you have to concede that it succeeds to an unusual degree for a 16-page conversation. It supplies a coherent causal architecture, and you can follow every joint of it. It runs from the 2013 agriculture to industry turn through the spatial and technological reorientation of GTP2 and Tilk Tihadeso into the decay of the EPRDF's arbitration organs, then the substitution of ethnic populism for economic populism after 2016, then the legal consolidation of executive prosecutorial power, and finally the post-war entrenchment of a securitized extraction economy that its own predictions anticipated in Tigray's goldfields, on the record, in print, before it happened. It preserves primary material that exists nowhere else in the published record, and we should be grateful for it. The Tzadkan message, the Seychelles channel, the Bereket Simon genealogy of Tigray's electoral reform, the philology of Brake. Where else would you get any of that? It performs a rare feat for a text emerging from Tigrayan advocacy. It turns its harshest category, gambling, comprador, rent-sharing elites, on Tigray's own post-war leadership. And its two structural wagers, that liberalization and centralization are one single process, and that the international system's market interest would keep underwriting that process regardless of atrocity, have been progressively vindicated by the float of the Burr, by the disbursement record, and by the extraction economy now documented on the ground by investigative journalists. What it does not achieve is the symmetrical accounting, the one that would subject the developmental state's own coercive equilibrium, the TPLF's long incumbency, and Eritrea's agency to the same dissection it performs so mercilessly on their successors and their patrons. That absence defines the work that remains, and it is work you will not find inside these 16 pages. Read critically, with its provenance in view, and its claims sorted the way we have just sorted them. This interview stands as the most substantial insider political economy account of the Ethiopian catastrophe yet published, and as a primary source whose interpretive frame future scholarship will have to argue with. Not around. One last thing, and it is the part that separates analysis from assertion. Where did all these numbers come from? Here is the ledger. The casualty and famine figures draw on Ghent University mortality research and on the African Union mediator Olusegun Obasanjo's public estimate of roughly 600,000 deaths, reported in the Financial Times in January 2023, with component estimates of 50,000 to 100,000 direct killings, 150,000 to 200,000 starvation deaths, and over 100,000 deaths from denied healthcare. The health system data draw on WHO and MSF assessments and on peer-reviewed studies in BMJ Global Health and the literature that followed. 86% of facilities structurally damaged, fewer than 1 in 10 functioning, maternal mortality moving from 186 to roughly 840 per 100,000, about 1,300 of some 20,000 health workers remaining, and on the pre-war facility inventory of 712 health posts, 233 health centers, and 47 hospitals. Sexual violence estimates cite the Tigray Health Bureau at more than 120,000, and Columbia University research reported by The Washington Post at more than 100,000. The trade and macroeconomic figures draw on National Bank of Ethiopia annual series, an ODI and GIZ macro trade profile for the 3.8% of GDP goods export figure across 2015 to 2020, IMF Article 4 and program documents, IMF press release 24/291 for the July 2024 extended credit facility. Credendo and Reuters reporting on the Burr float and the World Bank pledges, and Ethiopia Insights debt analysis. The industrial park figures draw on Industry ALAL for 2019 wages and employment, World Bank and IGC evaluation documents, the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights for the 2019 wage study, and reporting on the January 2022 AGOA expulsion. The METEC material draws on the Ethiopian news agency, Addis Standard, S&P Global, and Global Construction Review, reporting from 2018 and 2019, and on Addis Standard's March 2024 report of Kinfe Dagnews release. The mining material draws on East Africa Metals corporate disclosures, the Reporter of Ethiopia, Capital, and the November 2025 Globe and Mail and Bureau of Investigative Journalism investigation. The aid suspension material draws on Caritas, The New Humanitarian, Al Jazeera, Forbes, Addis Standard, and Associated Press reporting from April through December 2023. And the characterization of the UNDP memo rests on Foreign Policy's March 2021 reporting and on the interview's own account of it. All quotations from the interview itself are limited to the single short phrase identified in the analysis. Everything else you have heard is paraphrase. So, 16 pages, 2 cities, 15 months, 27 footnotes, one document on a table, an Ethiopian catastrophe that the headlines never explained, and a political economy nobody wanted to look at, until a woman with a very particular last name sat down across from a French political scientist and started naming the machinery. Now you have looked at it too. And you cannot say nobody showed you.